Let me perhaps provide a personal example first for folks, because some of this will be familiar to people who've listened for a long time, maybe to other episodes of the two of us, but a lot of it's going to be new. But I want to establish some priors just so people are aware of what this might look like in practice. So I have experimented with the ketogenic diet, also extended fasting. You can arrive at some similar places, but like you said, there can be some pretty heavy taxes to pay with extended fasting. The ketogenic diet I've experimented with all the way back to the 90s. Some of you weren't even born probably who are listening, but some of you will remember the 90s. And I was using it specifically for mood stabilizing. This was towards the end of college, but also to lean out while building muscle on something called the cyclical ketogenic diet. Yeah. So we're going to get to that later in the conversation, but it was effectively, let's call it 6 days of focusing on a ketogenic diet with 1 day or a half to 3/4 of a day of glycogen depletion, and then loading with more carbohydrates, lower fat, et cetera. The reason that the ketogenic diet became doubly interesting to me is that when I had Lyme disease the second time, which came with all sorts of co-infections like babesiosis and so on, and this isn't chronic fatigue or depression searching for a diagnosis that is external. I feel like sometimes the cottage industry of diagnosing and treating people for quote unquote Lyme disease can be shady at best. But in this case, I'm coming from Long Island. Everybody in my family has had tick-borne disease. Wow. And was credibly diagnosed. So the second time I had Lyme, I got to a point, because I did not see the bullseye rash, assumed I did not have it, which is a mistake because sometimes you don't see the dermatological response and you nonetheless have contracted something like Lyme disease. I ended up weeks later slurring my speech. Took me minutes to get out of bed because my joints hurt so much, forgetting friends' names. And my assistant said, "Tim, you really need to see someone. This isn't fatigue. I've seen you sick. I've seen you tired. This is something else." And suffice to say, that turned into several months, even post antibiotic treatment, which I do think is important, of, we could call it pseudo dementia. I mean, I really felt like I was operating at 10% cognitive capacity. And basically at my wit's end, I said, well, what can I control? Because a lot has not done the job. And I went into strict ketosis. What does that mean? That means that I'm consuming moderate protein, probably getting at least 50% of my calories from fat, and keeping my carbohydrates to less than 20 grams a day, probably at that point. And within 3 or 4 days, I'd probably say around day 3 or 4, because I wasn't very fat adapted at the time. My body wasn't well trained to use fat because I wasn't doing intermittent fasting, which we'll come back to. And within 3 or 4 days, effectively, all of my cognitive symptoms disappeared. And I stayed in that state through nutritional ketosis for a few weeks, had complete remission of any of the cognitive symptoms, plus the joint pain symptoms, and those never came back. And I recommended that, and this is not a randomized controlled trial, but over the years, due to various factors, we've had ticks growing in population, also expanding to the coasts and on the West Coast, that is, and elsewhere. I had 3 friends replicate this with ketosis after suffering various symptoms from tick-borne disease. And we were texting, maybe even talking about this, but I never had a great explanation for why it worked. I said, I don't know the exact mechanism. Maybe I have faulty glucose metabolism that was somehow, maybe something was impaired by the ticks, and therefore I'm giving my brain this alternate fuel that it really likes, ketones, but it didn't explain necessarily the durability of the changes, right? In brief, do you have a theory or an explanation for why that would work?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because quickly dozens, if not hundreds of people with tick-borne diseases, including Lyme disease and all the tick-borne diseases, have communicated with me. And one of the patients is actually Deanna Tadone, who was diagnosed with ALS prior to 2010 and has basically been stabilized, given 3 years to live. So I realized that It's underdiagnosed. The tests to do that are kind of controversial, with the CDC testing, the two-tier testing, and IGeneX. So I know I'm going off track a little bit here, but I think it's important to say that the spirochete Borrelia, that spirochete is essentially 100% glycolytic.
Mm-hmm.
And when you limit glucose availability and glycolysis, you are targeting the energy systems of that microbe. So that's one thing to think about. And it's well established now. It wasn't 3 years ago, but a ketogenic diet, in particular, beta hydroxybutyrate elevated in the blood, stimulates the adaptive immune response. And that's essentially your body's ability to target foreign invaders and neutralize them. And that has become a rapidly growing area of interest. University of Pennsylvania, they're doing CAR T therapy and checkpoint inhibitors because of the ketogenic enhancement of the adaptive immune response. And I think that plays a role. And situationally, I have observed that you go into ketosis if you have an inflammatory process, and Lyme disease is inflammatory. But people who have shingles and herpes simplex and things like that, I have an inbox full of people that do that. And I would like to experimentally go down that direction to understand why. But I think there's two reasons. You're targeting the energy systems and you're augmenting the immune response to keep the spirochete in a dormant stage, or maybe eradicating it in some contexts.
It's really incredible on a whole lot of levels. And I'm just lucky that I had the prior experience with the ketogenic diet to even have it occur to me as a last-ditch effort. And for people, if it wasn't clear, I mean, you explained it clearly, but glycolytic, I'm simplifying here, but it means that something needs to eat sugar or metabolize carbohydrates to survive, right?